So, hello everybody. Let me extend my warmest welcome at the second day of the Critical Suicidology conference to all of you in this room.
The Suicidology Conference. Well, that sounds awfully grim, but okay. Who is our speaker, and what is suicidology? Well, our speaker is Professor B. Schurer, aka Burkhard Schurer, and is a reader in religious studies at Canterbury Christ Church, University, UK. Professor Schurer's research interests include historical anthropology and feminist, queer, and post-colonialist approaches in the study of religions. Professor Schurer is also the director of INSICE, the Intersectional Center for Inclusion and Social Justice, the organization which hosted the conference at which this speech took place. All right, and so what is suicidology? Because prior to this, I had honestly never heard the term before. Suicidology is the scientific study of suicidal behavior and suicide prevention. There are many different fields and disciplines involved with suicidology, the two primary ones being psychology and sociology. So, it is the study of suicide. Well, simple enough. Which makes me all the more curious about the title of our subject video. Reframing suicide. All right, I am ready to be educated. How can we correctly reframe suicide?
I'm a professor of gender studies and religious studies.
Gender studies and religious studies. Interesting combination.
And I work mainly in the intersection of Buddhist philosophy and queer and trans-feminist theory.
Intersectional Buddhist philosophy and queer and trans-feminist theory. Man, I cannot believe how much my vocabulary is growing today.
As director of INSICE, I am proud to be a small part of this cutting-edge social justice turn in the study of suicide, which this conference embodies.
The social justice turn in the study of suicide. Okay, just so that I establish my own baseline of understanding before we continue, so far as I know, the act of suicide can fall into one of three general categories of motivation or circumstance. Either one, you're ending your life due to purely psychological stress, as from depression or mental illness. Two, you're ending your life to cease physical suffering, such as from a terminal disease or chronic pain. Or three, you're ending your life on behalf of preserving another life. Think of the jumping onto a live grenade scenario. Now, I understand there can be overlapping motivations and gray areas in individual cases, depending on the circumstances, but I think my list is a reasonable breakdown. Now that I've established where my head is at, let's continue with our professor.
It appears fitting that a research orientation towards intersectionality and social justice should include a keen interest on academic questions and applied advocacy around well-being, mental distress, and suicide.
Intersectionality and social justice need to include well-being and suicide. Well, okay. Can you tell us all of the other topics of concern that well-being and suicide will be joining within the magical land of intersectionality?
As diversity-oriented feminism tells us, intersectional identity facets including sex, gender identity, sexuality, or I prefer calling it variability, neurodiversity, race, ethnicity, cultural traditions, religious beliefs, age group, class, socioeconomic status, legal status, migrant status, veteran status, and so on.
And a partridge in a pear tree.
All these facets build up the shifting and fluing mosaic of our identity negotiations within societal contexts, in the tension, the constant tension of equal versus unequal, just versus unjust, social participation and opportunities.
Yes, life is strange and often unfair, often difficult. But there's accepting that fact, and then there's trying to pawn off the blame for it and the responsibility for altering one's circumstances to other people or to invisible forces. Intersectionality is a cop-out theory, attempting to turn the art of avoiding accountability into an academic vocation. And the scary thing is, it seems to be working.
When we look at the systemic failings of our societies to provide a nurturing and inspiring context for the thriving of our embodied identity performances.
Identity performances? That might be one of the more on-point descriptions of identity politics that I have heard. It's actually unintentionally brilliant.
The unique intersectional cocktail behind each individual embodied experience of oppression, stigma, marginalization, exclusion, and violence becomes urgently important both for our advocacy and solidarity work and in the radical challenges we make to the systemic societal scripts which produce sustained trauma, leading to self-completed deaths.
Okay, first off, that accent is something to behold. Secondly, that was a soliloquy of word salad nonsense. And thirdly, self-completed deaths. That is a far kinder and gentler way of saying suicide. So, is this the reframing we were promised?
This all could be described as the long overdue and crucially relevant social justice turn in the thinking around what, for the time being, I still call suicide, although I believe the term to be misleading and ultimately a misnomer.
Suicide is a misleading term. It is a misnomer. Okay, so if someone, for whatever reason, takes their own life, then what should we be calling it, Professor? Self-completed death?
When in preparation for this little talk, which I basically did very jet-lagged yesterday, so if I'm waffling on, I do apologize.
Oh, your waffling on is due to jet lag, not due to pseudo-intellectual, ideological gobbledygook? Got it.
Consulted the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus of the 3rd century before Common Era on the justified self-completed departure from life, I felt myself reassured about the nature of this term, for Chrysippus explicitly includes living and socio-economic injustice, penia, poverty, among his 5 reasons, tropoi, of justified suicide.
Wait, so you're reassured in your thinking because a 3rd century philosopher said that simply living in poverty was a justifiable reason for taking your own life. Though you didn't just say poverty, but rather socio-economic injustice. Setting aside the claim that all poor people are inherently victims of injustice, and taking our speaker at his word, all poor people are justified in killing themselves because they are victims of injustice. It is a rational response. That is crazy.
Apart from the well-known Stoic ethical reasonings on the necessity of self-chosen death. I'm not going to elaborate on that in order not to bore you with some Greek fragments.
You're not going to elaborate. You're going to pick one of this philosopher's 5 reasons for suicide out of context and leave the other 4 unsaid and unexplored. Define cherry picking.
But I think I felt quite chuffed about it. So there's already in the 3rd century something like a recognition of a social justice context. Widening this important impulse in Stoic philosophy, I emphatically, together with most of you, or all of you, support the shift away from individually framing and pathologizing occurrences of self-completed deaths.
Shifting away from individualizing instances of self-completed deaths. So, suicide needs to be a concept of collectivism? I must be misunderstanding.
Indeed, discriminatory discourses and practices, for instance religiously and/or culturally underpinned, regularly point to high suicidality in so-called abject populations such as LGBTIQ plus people as an inferred proof of their moral inferiority.
Most of the major religions are not keen on anyone straying outside of the heterosexual norm. And yes, I could easily see some adherents perceiving the suicide of such people as a de facto validation of their beliefs. What does this have to do with the reframing of suicide?
And as LGBTIQ identity performances as demonstrating an inherent mental disorder, you know, the Catholic view on the disorderedness of LGBTIQ activities and identity expressions.
Yes, religions don't like people who deviate from their dictates. But just as an entirely irrelevant aside, don't you work at Canterbury Christ Church University?
But, obviously, research firmly shows that not the marginalized abject is mentally disordered, but that abjection, rejection, stigma, and systemic societal aggression creates the mental distress, manifesting in alarmingly high suicidology numbers, for example, among trans people in general, and also among LGBTIQ plus youths in particular.
So, suicides among transgender and LGBT youths are the fault of society? Not the result of any mental illness or emotional distress, but systemic societal aggression. Okay.
Taking the heightened prevalence of drug usage and risk-taking behavior within segments of the LGBTIQ community into consideration, risk-seeking and unhealthy behavioral patterns, again, appear not as proof for moral degeneration, but as reactions to the undue systemic mental pressure on these groups.
So now also drug use and risky behavior among LGBT people are not the fault or responsibility of the individual, but a natural reaction to societal pressures. Got it.
They can be interpreted as less constructive attempts to develop resilience, or as expressing unhealthy coping mechanisms, sometimes even akin to semi-conscious, prolonged, phased, or gradual suicides.
Coping mechanisms or gradual, phased suicides. So, is this how we are to reframe suicide? Not as a singular act of self-destruction, but as an incremental self-destruction by drugs and risky behavior, which is actually the fault of society?
At this conference, thus, to look at the systemic causes for both gradual and sudden self-completed death among people living with social injustices. And we also need to examine the concrete, irresolvable traumatic experiences which express, perform, and focalize such systemic causes and traumata.
Systemic causes. Again, the causes of suicide, instantaneous or phased, are external here, and being inflicted upon the individual, they are not internal or self-inflicted. And what do we call it when death is caused by an external, systemic force? I see where this argument is headed, and it is absolutely insane.
These traumata occur and get inscribed in the embodied experiences of intersectionally marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed people whose social trauma often proves deadly. Trauma, the Greek word for wound, becomes murder, in the Greek word phonos. I maintain that most suicides, with the scarce exception of those voluntary deaths, for example, that are consciously enacted for a higher ethical good in the, for instance, Stoic and Buddhist traditions, that most suicides should not be called suicides.
Murder. Save for those instances of higher ethical good, as determined by our speaker, suicides are not suicides, but are instead murders. So, even after someone makes the ultimate self-destructive choice, even after they are dead, our speaker would absolve them of the responsibility of that choice and place the blame on society at large. Got it.
When a veteran sent as a pawn of late capitalist and nationalist interests returns from the trauma of the killing fields, and having served their function to a cynical society which willingly made them a killer, slowly spirals into self-destruction, unable to make sense of their alleged heroism in the face of the reality of horror.
A veteran. So, it's not just about LGBT persons. Soldiers traumatized by war and who commit suicide are actually victims of murder. Got it.
Or when a trans girl of color, lacking resources and strategies of resilience, succumbs to the hopelessness and inevitability of stigma, abuse, violence, and poverty.
A trans girl of color and the inevitability of stigma, abuse, and poverty. Poverty? Do you mean that socioeconomic injustice that entirely justifies suicide? Oh, but it's not suicide anymore. It's actually murder.
Or when a mentally variable person signs themselves out of a life without respect, love, and basic inclusive access to opportunities. In all these cases, why are we calling it suicide? What should be called murder? Where systemic injustice has translated into sustained trauma, I would speak of delayed, self-completed murder. It's not suicide. It's a delayed, self-completed murder.
Okay, our speaker goes on for another 5 minutes or so, reiterating points and arguments he's already made, but we've reached the meat of his claim. Suicides need to be reframed not as the result of internal struggles and conflicts, or mental instability, but rather as socially mandated acts of murder. Thus, we are all held to account for these self-inflicted deaths by those enlightened mediums, like our professor, who would claim to speak for the dead, and use the tragedies of others as a cudgel against their ideological opponents. And do you know what sickens me the most here? That this line of thinking might actually reinforce the notion that there is no hope to those feeling hopeless, that worries about being trapped or of having no light at the end of the tunnel are justified because it's systemic societal aggression, that it's not me holding the gun to my head, it's not me pulling the trigger, it is a vast antagonistic conspiracy against my well-being that is enacting this upon me. It really gives a whole new dimension to the phrase, "the devil made me do it." Suicide as murder, the ultimate and final abdication of responsibility. Social guilt, social accountability, social justice. As always, thank you for watching.